Hello, family. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also, share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Vivian stood by the kitchen window, her hands gently scrubbing a plate she'd already washed twice. Outside, the breeze rustled the mango leaves, but her heart wasn't at peace. Something had changed. Samuel, once warm and affectionate, now drifted like a stranger in the same room. He came home later, always with a story that didn't quite match. He barely noticed when she changed her hair, when she wore the dress he used to love. Instead, his eyes seemed fixed on his phone, a small smirk tugging at his lips whenever a message pinged. She noticed he always locked his phone now. He never used to. Later that evening, while Vivian laid out dinner and called for Samuel, Daisy toddled into the dining room in her princess pajamas, carrying a crumpled drawing. "Mummy," she said, tugging at her wrapper, "why does Auntie Clara come here when you're not home?" Vivian froze. The spoon in her hand paused midair. She crouched slowly to Daisy's level and asked gently, "What do you mean, baby?" Daisy shrugged and replied, "I saw her in Daddy's car after school. She said not to tell you." A lump formed in Vivian's throat. Her best friend? She smiled tightly, ruffling Daisy's hair. "You're such a smart girl," she said softly, but inside something sharp and bitter twisted in her chest. She looked across the hall, where Samuel sat on the couch scrolling. The whispers were no longer just in the air. They were beginning to take shape. Vivian carried the steaming pot of egusi soup to the dining table, her eyes flicking briefly to the two people already seated. Clara had arrived unannounced again, and somehow convinced Samuel to let her stay for dinner. She sat with the ease of someone who belonged, her manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of wine as she tossed her head back in laughter. Samuel laughed with her, louder than Vivian had heard him laugh in weeks. His face relaxed, his eyes brightened. It wasn't the laugh of a man enduring polite company. It was the laugh of someone enjoying a secret joke with someone who made him feel seen. Vivian felt invisible. She moved around the table like a ghost, placing the plates, ladling out soup, smiling faintly when Clara complimented the aroma. But inside, her heart clutched tightly. Every joke Clara cracked, every little wink in Samuel's direction, chipped away at the woman who used to feel safe in her own home. And when Samuel leaned over to refill Clara's glass without being asked, Vivian excused herself and walked quietly into the kitchen, pressing her palm against her chest to still its trembling beat. Behind the closed kitchen door, Vivian leaned against the counter, staring at nothing. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they meant. There was a new closeness between Samuel and Clara, subtle yet suffocating. Clara had always been the spontaneous one, the life of every gathering. But now, her laughter didn't sound like joy, it sounded like conquest. Vivian replayed the moments from earlier, Clara brushing her hand along Samuel's arm, him not pulling away. Her heart ached not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that the betrayal was still unfolding, still blooming, right in front of her. She wiped her hands on the edge of her wrapper and whispered to herself, "He didn't even ask if I had eaten." That sentence hung in the air like a cruel echo. She pulled out her phone to text Theodore, to say she wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend not to see. But instead, she erased the words and put the phone down. She couldn't speak yet. She didn't want anyone to know she was starting to break. The morning sun spilled through the curtains as Vivian stared at the ceiling, hoping Samuel would remember. It was their 8th wedding anniversary. 8 years of shared promises, of family, of love they swore would last forever. She had dressed early, choosing the blue dress he'd complimented years ago on a Sunday morning when they were still newlyweds. She made his favorite breakfast, plantain frittata with freshly squeezed juice, and set the table neatly, adding a single candle in the middle, just for sentiment. But as the clock ticked past 9 a.m., she realized she was the only one remembering. Samuel had left for work without a word, no note, no kiss on her forehead, not even a happy anniversary. Vivian sat at the dining table, staring at the empty seat across from her, the food now cold, untouched. She didn't cry immediately. She just sat there for what felt like hours, clenching and unclenching her hands beneath the table as silence rang louder than ever. That afternoon, a message pinged on her phone. It was from Clara. "Happy anniversary, lovebirds. Hope you guys are doing something special tonight." The words stung like acid. Vivian stared at the message, unsure if it was sarcasm, a mockery, or worse, genuine ignorance of what she'd done. But something told her Clara knew. Vivian didn't reply. Instead, she packed up the untouched breakfast and carried it to the kitchen with trembling hands. Later, when Samuel returned home, Vivian waited. She wanted to give him a chance to remember, to explain. But all he did was slump onto the couch, loosen his tie, and ask what was for dinner. No flowers, no mention of the date. "Nothing," she said softly, standing behind him. "Dinner's already over." He didn't even turn around. Vivian walked slowly to their bedroom and closed the door behind her. For the first time in their marriage, she didn't feel like his wife. She felt like a stranger living under his roof. Later that week, Vivian was cleaning up Daisy's crayons when she noticed a new drawing pinned to the fridge. It showed 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, one child. All were holding hands. But what made Vivian pause was the addition of a 4th figure, standing nearby. It was labeled Mummy, and the middle adult was labeled Auntie Clara. Her eyes scanned it again. Daisy had drawn herself standing between Daddy and Auntie Clara, while Mummy stood alone with a sad face. Vivian knelt slowly, her heart cracking as she called her daughter over. "Daisy, baby," she said gently, "can you tell Mummy what this picture means?" Daisy grinned, innocent and proud of her work. "That's us," she said cheerfully. "Auntie Clara says we're becoming a new family now, but I don't want you to be sad, so I still drew you there." Vivian blinked, unable to hide the shock on her face. "She said what?" she asked, voice tight. Daisy looked up, confused. "She said it's okay. You'll have your own house soon, and I can come visit you sometimes." Vivian nodded slowly, her throat burning. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, kissing her forehead before turning away, so Daisy wouldn't see the tears sliding down her cheeks. That night, Vivian sat alone in the living room, clutching the drawing. The living room that used to echo with laughter and shared memories now felt like borrowed space. Clara had crossed boundaries that could never be redrawn. And Samuel was letting it happen. No, he was helping it happen. Vivian remembered all the times she had defended Clara, trusted her, called her sister. How long had Clara been planting these ideas in Daisy's head, preparing her for a life without her mother? It wasn't just betrayal, it was manipulation of the cruelest kind. Vivian stared at the drawing again, then carefully folded it and tucked it into her Bible. "God," she whispered aloud, "if this is the storm, then help me endure it. But let me come out whole, please." The silence that followed was thick and still, but in her heart, she felt the quiet weight of a resolve beginning to grow. Vivian hadn't intended to clean their bedroom that afternoon. She was emotionally drained and had barely touched her lunch. But a persistent need for distraction led her to change the bedsheets. As she pulled off the pillowcases, something glittered beneath Samuel's side of the bed. She bent down, heart suddenly heavy, and retrieved it, a single gold hoop earring, delicate and familiar. Clara's. She recognized it instantly. The same pair Clara wore last week to brunch. Vivian stared at the object, her fingers trembling as anger brewed beneath her skin. There was no reason, no justifiable reason, why Clara's earring should be in her marital bed. Not near the dining table, not on the guest sofa, not even in the guest room, but under Samuel's pillow? No accident could explain that. Her chest tightened. Vivian didn't scream or cry. She placed the earring on the center of the bed and sat on the edge in silence, staring at it as if it would confess. Her mind raced with questions she didn't want answers to anymore. When Samuel got home, Vivian waited. As he loosened his tie and placed his keys on the side table, she walked into the room holding the earring in her open palm. "Clara forgot something," she said flatly. Samuel blinked, his jaw stiffening slightly. "Where did you find that?" he asked too quickly. Vivian's eyes didn't leave his. "Under your side of the bed," she replied. Silence. Then came the rehearsed chuckle, the shrug. She must have dropped it when she came to drop off those files from the firm. "Maybe she sat on the bed when she was helping me look for my cufflink," he said, brushing past her toward the bathroom. Vivian turned slowly, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Why was she in our bedroom, Samuel?" No answer, only the sound of running water. She didn't pursue it further. She just stood there, watching the bathroom door, realizing it was no longer just suspicion. It was confirmation, and that hurt more than she'd prepared for. The next afternoon, as clouds gathered over the city, Vivian heard a knock at the gate. She wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping her hands, she went to open it and found Theodore standing there in a crisp blue shirt, a frown drawn across his thoughtful face. "You have a minute?" he asked gently. Vivian led him inside and offered tea, but he declined. He sat across from her, eyes steady. "Viv, I've kept quiet because I didn't want to meddle. But I think you need to hear this now." Vivian tensed, her heart already bracing. "I saw Clara 2 nights ago," he began, "at the rooftop bar on 3rd Avenue. She wasn't alone. Samuel was with her. They weren't sitting like colleagues, Viv." Vivian looked away. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "I found her earring under our bed." Theodore's face darkened. "I was afraid of that." He leaned forward. "Listen, Clara has always competed with you, even when you didn't notice. But this is sabotage. I don't think she's just playing around. She's positioning herself." Vivian swallowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "She calls me sister," she said bitterly. Theodore shook his head. "People who envy you the most call you sister first. Be careful." The words sank like stones. Vivian bit her bottom lip, unsure of what action to take. "I can't throw her out. Samuel would defend her," she murmured. "Then don't waste your strength fighting in a house where your voice no longer matters," Theodore replied, standing. "Start preparing your heart. This may get worse before it gets better." As he left, Vivian stood by the window, watching the rain begin to fall. Theodore had said what her soul already knew. Clara was no longer a guest, she was a replacement in the making. And Vivian was no longer just a wife, she was being quietly erased. That realization hit her harder than any confrontation. She felt the first real flicker of something rising inside her, not rage, but a readiness to protect what was hers, even if it meant losing everything else. It was a blistering afternoon when Vivian returned from the market with 2 heavy bags hanging from her wrists, sweat dotting her brow. She pushed the gate open and made her way to the front door, balancing the bags as she reached for the handle. But the key didn't turn. Confused, she tried again. Nothing. She stepped back and knocked, expecting one of the house helps to open. After a long pause, the door swung open, but it wasn't the house help. It was Clara, standing tall, holding a chilled glass of water like she owned the place. "Oh," Clara said with a sly smile, "you're back early." Vivian forced a breath. "The key isn't working," she said. Clara sipped her water slowly. "Yes. Samuel had the locks changed yesterday. He said it was for security. You should probably call him." Vivian's mouth fell open. "He didn't tell me." Clara shrugged, stepping aside casually. "You should talk to him. I'm just here keeping the peace." Vivian stepped in, the familiar warmth of the house replaced by a cold, foreign tension. The decor had already changed, pillows replaced, curtains swapped. She looked around and realized her photos were missing from the living room wall. "Where are our pictures?" she asked, voice trembling. Clara smirked. "We're just decluttering." Samuel said it was time for a new vibe. Vivian stood still, her shopping bag slowly slipping from her fingers to the floor. She wasn't in her home anymore. She was in a space she had built, now claimed by someone who had once held her hand and called her sister. Her knees buckled slightly from the weight of the moment, but she caught herself. She bent, picked up her bags, and walked straight to the bedroom, her steps slow, deliberate. Clara's voice followed her like poison. "You might want to start packing, Viv. Some changes are coming." Vivian didn't answer. But in her chest, something shifted permanently. It wasn't sadness this time. It was the beginning of goodbye. The official letter came folded in a brown envelope, delivered by a courier with no expression and no words. Vivian opened it slowly, her hands cold despite the humid air. The first sentence blurred as her eyes skimmed over words like petition, marital separation, and temporary custody. She sat on the edge of the bed, the room spinning faintly as she tried to grasp how it had come to this. Samuel hadn't spoken to her, not even a warning. Not a conversation, just paperwork. And there it was in black and white. Her marriage, reduced to procedural terms and signatures. Her name beside his, no longer entwined in love, but trapped in legal jargon. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up over the past weeks. She picked up the phone and called Theodore. Her voice was low but steady. "The separation is official," she said. "Can Daisy and I stay with you for a few weeks?" On the other end, Theodore answered gently. "My doors are always open, Vivian. You and Daisy deserve peace." Packing was the quietest goodbye she'd ever experienced. Daisy sat on the bed, confused and clutching her toy bunny, while Vivian folded clothes into a small suitcase. "Where are we going, Mummy?" Daisy asked in a tiny voice. Vivian paused. "Just to Uncle Theo's house, darling. It's quieter there." The girl frowned. "But why can't we stay here? I want Daddy to come too." Vivian closed her eyes for a moment, then knelt down beside her daughter. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "mummies and daddies need space to think clearly. But we'll be okay, you hear me?" Daisy nodded, though her eyes brimmed with questions. Vivian took one last look around the room, stripped of warmth, stripped of history, and zipped the suitcase. Clara stood at the corridor, arms crossed, watching with a tilted head and a smile too smug for the moment. "Need help with the door," she offered mockingly. Vivian didn't respond. She simply walked out, her daughter in one hand and her pride in the other. She didn't look back. Whatever future wager waited for her would be built from the ashes of this goodbye, but it would be hers alone. Nighttime brought silence, but not sleep. Daisy lay curled beside Vivian on a guest mattress in Theodore's spare room, eyes wide open, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan. "Mummy," she whispered, nudging her mother gently, "can we go back tomorrow? I want to sleep in my bed. My bunny misses home." Vivian blinked back the ache in her chest. "Not yet, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing hair from Daisy's forehead. "We need to stay here for now." Daisy's lip trembled. "Is it because Daddy doesn't love you anymore?" The words struck Vivian like an arrow. She wrapped her daughter tightly in her arms. "No, baby," she whispered, her voice catching. "Sometimes adults make mistakes, and sometimes love gets lost." Daisy clung to her, silent now, and it was in that silence that Vivian felt her daughter's tears soak through her blouse. It wasn't loud, just quiet weeping, the kind that clings to a mother's soul. She didn't try to stop her. Let her cry, she thought. Let her grieve in the only way a child knows how. The next morning, Daisy didn't speak much. She ate half her cereal, stared blankly at cartoons, and asked once if Clara was still in the house. Vivian replied with a neutral, "I think so," not wanting to fill her daughter's mind with bitterness. Later, while folding the clothes Theodore had helped them wash, Vivian found Daisy's drawings scattered across the bed, pictures of their house, her toys, even one of Samuel and Clara smiling with Daisy stuck in the middle, frowning. Vivian carefully gathered them into a file, unsure whether to keep them as evidence of trauma or erase them altogether. Her phone buzzed. It was Samuel. A short message, "Hope Daisy's okay." No question about Vivian. No mention of regret. Just a sentence that felt like a formality. She didn't reply. Instead, she looked over at her daughter, curled up on the couch, a blanket tucked around her like armor. Vivian walked over and sat beside her, stroking her arm. "We're going to be okay," she said aloud, though she wasn't sure if it was for Daisy or herself. Maybe both. The rumors began quietly, first among neighbors, then the church group, then the parent WhatsApp chat. Everyone wanted to know why Clara was living in Vivian's house, decorating it, answering Samuel's calls, smiling like the queen of a castle she never built. Vivian tried to ignore it, but curiosity gave way to disbelief when she drove past her former street to drop off Daisy's forgotten shoes. There, hanging across the gate, was a new welcome sign. "Home is where the heart is," in pastel gold lettering. Clara's touch was unmistakable. Vivian parked down the street and stared at the gate for a long time. Clara had moved in. It wasn't just suspicion or whispers anymore. It was reality, flaunted for the world to see. She was no longer the secret. She was the replacement. The new mistress of a home that still bore Vivian's scent in the curtains, her memories in the walls. And Samuel, he allowed it. No shame. No explanation. Just transition, swift and unapologetic. Inside the house, Clara held a mug of coffee and twirled in the living room, instructing the decorator where to hang new art pieces. I want the space to reflect peace and elegance, she said with a smirk. The decorator, unaware of the home's recent history, nodded politely. Of course, ma'am. Clara turned to Samuel, who sat half distracted at the corner with his laptop open. Do you think the rug should be cream or ash gray? She asked sweetly. Samuel gave a half smile. Whichever you like. Clara walked over and sat beside him. You're still thinking about her, aren't you? She whispered. He didn't respond. She traced her finger along his arm. Don't worry. Soon, everyone will see this house as ours. She had her time. It's our time now. Samuel said nothing, but deep down something stirred. Not guilt, not love. Just a vague sense that something sacred had been broken, and maybe, just maybe, not everything could be so easily replaced. Clara leaned into the soft white chair in Samuel's study and angled her phone just right, snapping a selfie with the caption, Blended Love, Healing Home. Moments later, she uploaded a carousel of photos to social media, her fingers intertwined with Samuel's, Daisy's school backpack hanging on the wall, the redesigned living room filled with scented candles and plush decor. Each image was carefully curated to paint a perfect portrait of a new, happy family. She tagged Samuel, used hashtags like second chances and grace and growth, and smiled as the comments rolled in. Oh, finally. So happy for you two. God is rewriting your love story. Clara basked in the applause. What none of them knew was that behind the polished images, the silence in the house was growing louder. Samuel rarely joined her in conversation. He responded to affection like a man distracted, physically present, but emotionally vacant. And still, Clara posted, if the outside world believed in their love, then maybe Samuel would start to believe it too. That evening, Samuel scrolled through the photos Clara had tagged him in. He didn't remember posing for half of them. A strange discomfort sat in his chest as he looked at the image of Daisy's school bag. Clara had staged it all. He sighed and pushed his phone away. Clara appeared behind him, wrapping her arms around his neck. People love us, she murmured. They're rooting for us, you see? He didn't respond. Instead, he asked, did you ask Vivian if it was okay to post Daisy's things? Clara's face stiffened. Samuel, she's your daughter too. You don't need permission to live your life. He pulled away gently. She's not a prop, Clara. Her smile faltered for just a second before returning, tight and forced. You're overthinking again. Let's enjoy this, please. Samuel looked out the window, searching the horizon for something he couldn't name. The world might have bought the fairy tale Clara crafted, but deep inside, he was beginning to feel trapped in a story he didn't recognize anymore. While social media praised Clara's journey to love, Vivian remained quiet. She saw the posts, friends sent screenshots with concerned emojis, and even her church women's group whispered in private chats. But she never reacted, never commented, never posted a counter-narrative. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was war in disguise. Every time she looked at those pictures, especially the ones that included Daisy's belongings, something twisted inside her. Still, she said nothing. Instead, she journaled, long, detailed entries of pain, betrayal, and healing. Theodore noticed the way she no longer winced when Samuel was mentioned. You're not numb, he observed one day while they walked in the park with Daisy. You're focused. That's more dangerous. Vivian smiled faintly. I just realized shouting won't make them hear. They're too drunk on their own lies. Her energy shifted, not to revenge, but to preservation. She applied for new contracts at work. She enrolled Daisy in therapy. And she started planning, quietly, without spectacle. Late one evening, Vivian sat on the balcony of Theodore's apartment, staring out at the moon. Daisy had fallen asleep curled on the couch after watching a cartoon, and Theodore sat beside her with a cup of ginger tea. You're strong, he said, breaking the silence. But strength doesn't mean you shouldn't speak up. Vivian turned to him. Oh, I will. But not yet. Let her dance in the middle of the stage. Every show ends. Theodore studied her for a moment. You really think Clara's happiness is a performance? Vivian smiled bitterly. She's not happy. She's winning. There's a difference. Real joy doesn't need an audience. Her voice held no bitterness, just clarity. And in that moment, Theodore saw not just a woman scorned, but a woman reborn. One who had endured betrayal and had chosen not to break. Her silence wasn't absence. It was a weapon, waiting for the right time to speak. The invitation came in the most unexpected way, through Daisy. The child returned from a weekend visit with her father, holding a glittery pink envelope. "Auntie Clara said to give you this," she said innocently, handing it over. Vivian opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the calligraphy. "Dinner at home. Let's bury the hatchet and start afresh." For Daisy's sake, her hands went cold. Theodore read it over her shoulder and scoffed. "She's not asking for peace. She's staging another performance." Vivian nodded quietly, but deep down, something told her she had to go. Not for closure, not for Clara, but for herself. "I need to see what she looks like when she stares me in the face," she said softly. Theodore frowned. "Then don't go alone." Vivian agreed, but not with words. She knew this wasn't just dinner, it was a test of control. And she was done being controlled. That Friday evening, Vivian dressed simply but beautifully in a navy blue gown that hugged her softly and flowed with grace. When she walked into her former home, the air felt heavier than she remembered. Clara greeted her at the door with an overly sweet smile. "Vivian, you look radiant," she said with fake enthusiasm. "Thank you for coming, for Daisy." Vivian looked her in the eye and replied calmly, "Let's keep it for Daisy then." The table was set elegantly, 3 wine glasses, candles, silverware laid with precision. Samuel sat at the head, visibly uncomfortable, barely able to meet Vivian's eyes. Clara played host flawlessly, offering Vivian food with a performative cheerfulness. "I made your favorite jollof with goat meat. Just like old times," she cooed. Vivian smiled faintly, her mind alert to every move. It wasn't the food or setting that unnerved her. It was the sense that something had been premeditated. And as she lifted her fork, her daughter's eyes darted between the women at the table. She was watching too, and for the first time Vivian realized Daisy saw more than anyone knew. The kitchen was dimly lit, except for the overhead pendant light that pooled golden warmth onto the marble counter. Clara stood in her silk robe, alone, humming a lullaby as she delicately stirred a thick pot of stew. The kitchen clock ticked softly behind her, and from the adjacent room, faint music floated from a Bluetooth speaker. On the surface, it looked like the scene of a devoted homemaker preparing a welcome meal. But Clara's hands were not preparing with love, they were calculating, rehearsing. She reached for the tiny vial hidden in her makeup purse, the label peeled off, the cap sticky from condensation. Her hands moved quickly now, checking over her shoulder, ears perked for footsteps. With a small spoon, she stirred the contents into the red stew, watching it dissolve completely. The acid was odorless, colorless, lethal in small quantities. She'd researched everything. Her plan was simple: make Vivian sick enough to leave permanently, or worse, never rise from bed again. She wasn't sorry, not anymore. "You had your chance," Clara whispered to no one as she wiped the spoon and rinsed it carefully, placing it back in the drawer as though nothing had happened. What Clara didn't notice, though, was the small figure standing at the kitchen door, barefoot, half asleep, clutching a stuffed bunny. Daisy had wandered in to get water, but froze when she saw Auntie Clara talking to herself. She didn't understand the contents of the vial or the strange gleam in Clara's eye, but she knew it wasn't right. Clara glanced back sharply at the sound of movement, her face briefly contorting in panic. But when she saw Daisy, she relaxed into a smile. "Sweetheart, why are you out of bed?" she cooed, wiping her hands. Daisy blinked. "I was thirsty," she murmured. Clara handed her a juice box from the fridge and gently guided her back to her room, her fingers tight on Daisy's small shoulder. "You didn't see anything, did you?" Clara whispered playfully. "No," Daisy replied, eyes wide. When Clara returned to the kitchen, she plated the meal. 2 servings, one plain, the other laced. She couldn't tell which one Daisy would switch, but it didn't matter. As long as Vivian ate the right one, the night would end in Clara's favor. Or so she thought. The dinner table was quiet, too quiet for Vivian's liking. Daisy sat beside her, unusually still, her fork barely lifting food to her mouth. Clara laughed at her own jokes, her words spilling like perfume trying to cover a stench. Samuel, ever withdrawn these days, focused on cutting his meat as if it were a lifeline, avoiding eye contact with either woman. Vivian noticed everything, how Clara subtly pushed a particular plate closer to her, how her eyes flickered with anticipation, every time Vivian touched her spoon. The food smelled normal, the stew warm, rich. But something in her gut twisted, an instinct she couldn't ignore. Just as she reached out to take a spoonful of the rice and stew, Daisy tugged on her sleeve. "Mummy," the child said suddenly, "can I have your plate? Yours looks nicer." Clara's head snapped up so fast the candlestick nearly tipped. "No, no, Daisy, yours is fine," she said quickly, voice sharp for the first time that evening. But Daisy held her ground. "Please, Mummy, I like yours better." Vivian looked at her daughter carefully, then at Clara, whose face had gone pale beneath her makeup. Something cold crawled down her spine. "Of course, baby," she said softly and began to switch the plates. Clara's hand twitched slightly but remained in her lap. Samuel looked up now, sensing something tense in the air. "Is something wrong?" he asked, watching Clara. "Nothing at all," Clara said, voice tight, her smile brittle. Vivian finished swapping plates with Daisy and continued eating slowly, watching Clara from under her lashes. Clara stared at her own food like it was poison, which it was. She took a reluctant bite, and Vivian noticed her twitch again. "Delicious," Clara muttered, clearing her throat and reaching for her glass of water. Daisy nibbled her food calmly beside her mother, unconsciously having just rewritten the outcome of the evening. Vivian's appetite faded, but she maintained her composure. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. But her daughter, her sweet, observant child, had just tipped a scale no adult could have predicted. And now, all Vivian could do was wait and see what karma would choose to reveal first. The silence following dinner was fragile, like a stretched wire ready to snap. Clara excused herself after the second bite, claiming sudden nausea. Samuel offered to call a doctor, but she waved it off, staggering toward the bathroom with one hand pressed to her stomach. Vivian stayed seated, watching the table, her eyes scanning the used utensils, the half-eaten plates. Daisy, unaware of the chaos blooming, hummed a tune while folding a napkin into a butterfly. From the hallway came the sound of vomiting, guttural, painful. Samuel rose to go check, but Vivian stopped him gently. "Give her space," she said, her voice calm. Deep down, she already knew what had happened. Her instincts from earlier, the tension in Clara's hands, Daisy's insistence, everything aligned now in terrifying clarity. Clara had tampered with the food. She had tried to hurt her. But something shifted Daisy. Daisy had changed the story, and now the poison had gone back to its sender. Minutes passed. Then came the crash of a glass breaking in the bathroom, followed by a loud groan. Samuel rushed to her side, shouting Clara's name. Vivian remained seated, holding Daisy close, her heartbeat loud in her ears. From the bathroom doorway, Samuel's voice cracked. "She needs help. Vivian, she's burning." Vivian rose slowly, her hands steady, her eyes dry. "Call an ambulance," she said. Samuel grabbed his phone, dialing frantically. In the background, Clara's cries grew louder, anguished, panicked, incoherent. Vivian walked over to Daisy and crouched beside her. "Did you see something earlier?" she asked softly. Daisy nodded. "She put something in your food when you weren't looking. I switched it so you'd get the pretty one instead." Vivian held her daughter tightly, tears forming for the first time in weeks, not from sadness, but from the terrifying relief that innocence had saved her life. In another room, Clara writhed in her own betrayal. And as sirens wailed in the distance, Vivian whispered a quiet prayer, not of vengeance, but of gratitude. The emergency room was harshly lit, its sterile air thick with urgency. Samuel paced back and forth, running a hand through his hair as nurses rushed Clara into the treatment area. Her screams had lessened, now replaced by intermittent groans and raspy sobs. The doctor emerged from the curtain and approached Samuel, his face grim. "She ingested a corrosive chemical," he said flatly. "It caused internal burns and tissue damage. We're stabilizing her, but she'll need reconstructive treatment, and there may be permanent disfigurement." Samuel stared at him, speechless. "What kind of chemical?" he finally asked. "We won't know until toxicology reports come back," the doctor replied. "But it was no accident." As he walked away, Samuel turned slowly and saw Vivian standing by the corridor, with Daisy held tightly in her arms. Their eyes met, his full of fear and confusion, hers calm and unreadable. "Did you know?" Samuel asked, voice barely above a whisper as he approached Vivian. She tilted her head, her eyes steady. "I didn't. But I had a feeling. He stepped back. Do you think she tried to? His voice cracked under the weight of it. Vivian didn't answer right away. She stroked Daisy's hair, shielding her ears with her hands. I think she wanted me out of the way, she said finally. I think she planned it carefully. But God had a different plan. Samuel rubbed his hands over his face, the realization sinking in like lead. This can't be real. Vivian's voice was steady. It is. You brought her in. You gave her my space. My child. My home. Samuel turned away, his shame unbearable. Vivian stepped closer. But she made one mistake, she whispered. She underestimated a child's love for her mother. Daisy saved me, not you. As nurses wheeled Clara past them, groaning and half-conscious, Vivian didn't look. She simply held Daisy tighter and walked out of the hospital, leaving Samuel to stand alone in the ruins of his choices. Clara awoke to a dim room, her throat raw and her lips cracked. The first thing she felt was pain, a deep, burning ache in her chest and face. Her hand flew to her cheek, only to recoil at the sensation of gauze and rigid bandages. She blinked hard as the events of the previous night unraveled in her memory. The laughter, the meal, the switch. Daisy, Vivian. Panic surged in her as the door creaked open and Samuel stepped in, carrying a flask. He looked worn, his eyes dark, his shoulders heavy with something that resembled guilt. You're awake, he said. Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out, only a strained croak. Samuel walked to the side of the bed and placed the flask down without looking at her. They said it was acid, he muttered. The doctors. They also said it was intentional. His voice was emotionless, like a man repeating a verdict handed to him. Clara tried to speak again, but tears pooled at the corners of her eyes instead. She hadn't planned for this. She had wanted control, not destruction. Not this kind of pain. Samuel sat down but didn't move closer. Was it meant for Vivian? He asked finally. Clara's head turned, but she didn't nod or shake. Just silence. He stared at her, waiting for an answer that would not come. You were supposed to be her friend, he said, his voice colder now. And I let you in. His hands balled into fists. You've ruined everything, and worst of all, Daisy saw it. She was in the house when you poisoned her mother's food. Do you even know what that does to a child? Clara whimpered as the words cut through her like blades. She saved Vivian, Samuel said, more to himself now. A 6-year-old did what I failed to do. He stood up and headed to the door. You'll be transferred to a private ward after evaluation. Police are already asking questions. You should think carefully before they come. He paused at the door. And don't ask about Daisy again. She won't be visiting. Clara tried to call after him, but her voice dissolved into sobs. And for the first time she knew there was no returning to who she was before. There was only the aftermath of what she had become. By the time the story began to circulate in whispers through the community, Clara had already drafted her own narrative. In her version, she was the victim, poisoned by a jealous ex-wife who couldn't handle her husband's new life. She switched the plates, Clara said tearfully to her first visitor, an old friend who looked unconvinced. I didn't even know what was in the food. Her voice, though raspy and broken, still carried its old manipulative cadence. She was obsessed. You know how calm Vivian always is. It's an act. She wanted to ruin me. But as word spread and more people asked questions, Clara's version began to unravel. Too many inconsistencies. Too much evidence. Her fingerprints on the vial. Daisy's recorded therapy testimony, childlike but alarmingly clear. Her own search history. Vivian hadn't said a word to the press, but truth, like sunlight, found its way in through the cracks. And Clara, once adored, was now pitied. Pitied and feared. Back at Theodore's home, Vivian sat on the veranda with Daisy tucked in her lap. The child had become unusually quiet since the incident. A therapist now came every Wednesday, gently helping her put words to what she'd seen. She said to keep quiet, Daisy whispered one evening, her eyes staring far away. She smiled, but it wasn't nice. It was like a monster was hiding inside her face. Vivian kissed the top of her head, whispering, You were brave. You did the right thing. That night, Theodore joined them with a quiet sigh. Samuel came by the office today, he said. He wants to talk. Vivian shook her head. He had his chance. Theodore paused. He's not asking for forgiveness. I think he's just broken. Vivian looked down at Daisy and held her tighter. Let him fix himself first. We're finally safe. That's what matters now. She stood and carried her daughter inside, her heart still bruised but her mind clearer than ever. She wasn't playing the blame game. She was choosing peace, and this time she would not let anyone steal it. Theodore sat at his mahogany desk, the morning sun casting sharp angles across stacks of files and folders. Vivian sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of truth hanging heavily between them. She had finally agreed to share everything with him, the incident at the dinner table, Daisy's sudden switch of plates, Clara's reaction, and the eerie certainty that it hadn't been a mistake. Theodore listened intently, his face calm but focused. Viv, if what you're saying is accurate, we can't just let this rest. This isn't just betrayal. This is attempted murder, he said firmly. Vivian hesitated, her eyes drifting to a framed photo of Daisy on his desk. He had placed it there without telling her. Do you really think anyone will believe me? She asked softly. She's already playing victim. Theodore shook his head. It's not about belief anymore. We have a timeline, hospital records, and most importantly, we have Daisy. What she saw. How she acted, it changes everything. That afternoon, Theodore contacted a private investigator, a former police detective named Baco, known for discretion and detail. Within 48 hours, Baco delivered a folder of findings to Theodore's office. Vivian sat frozen as she flipped through pages. Surveillance footage from a pharmacy where Clara purchased a chemical under a false name, messages to a supplier requesting something strong and fast-acting, and deleted browser searches recovered from her old device. How to mask taste of acid, stomach lining survival. Theodore closed the folder and exhaled deeply. We now have more than suspicion, he said. We have intent. Vivian looked up slowly. What happens next? Theodore leaned forward. We hand it over to the authorities, and we let the truth do what it's meant to do. Clara's already under medical watch, but with this, the case will be reopened officially. They'll investigate her fully this time, and no reputation or charm will save her. Vivian stood silently, then nodded. Let them come for her, not with hate, just with the justice she deserves. For the first time in weeks, her voice held no bitterness, only quiet courage. Clara sat alone in the hospital's private recovery suite, the windows shut tight, mirrors covered with linen. But even without a reflection, she knew. Her face itched constantly, her cheekbones felt taut and uneven. The left side of her face, once admired and envied, was now stitched and swollen, the skin grafts healing slowly under layers of ointment and gauze. When the nurses cleaned her wounds, she tried to turn away, but each time, the image flashed in her mind. Vivian's calm face at the dinner table, Daisy's innocent eyes, and the fire that exploded inside her throat the moment she swallowed. She had nightmares where she screamed, and no one turned to help. Now even her voice was altered, hoarse, guttural, edged with shame. When a nurse offered her a mirror that morning, Clara slapped it away, sobbing as it clattered to the floor. I don't want to see, she cried. I don't want to see what I've become. Later that day, Samuel arrived and stood awkwardly at the doorway, as though unsure whether to enter. Clara glanced up, but didn't speak. The police are coming again, he said after a pause. They've reopened the case. She turned her head away. So that's it? You just let them? He didn't respond. I loved you, she rasped. I did all of this for you. Samuel's face hardened. You tried to kill someone, Clara. You poisoned a child's dinner table. I don't know what you did out of love, but none of it looks like it now. Clara gripped the sides of the bed, her chest heaving. Vivian was always in the way, she spat. She didn't deserve that family. I did. I gave you everything. You gave me nothing but regret, Samuel cut in sharply. You stole peace. You brought hell into my daughter's life. He stepped back toward the door. Don't expect me to protect you anymore. I already lost too much trying to believe your version of love. Clara's mouth opened, but the words caught in her throat. She was alone. And for the first time, the mirror wasn't the thing she feared. It was herself. The therapy room was warm and softly lit, decorated with plush toys and crayons that littered the little corner table. Daisy sat quietly on the floor, drawing a picture of a dinner table with stick figures. Her mum, her dad, and a fourth person who was upside down. The therapist, Mrs. Olabisi, watched gently from her chair. Daisy, she said softly. Can you tell me what this picture means? Daisy looked up, her brown eyes thoughtful. That's when I switched the food, she said with a small voice. Auntie Clara made something scary. I saw her laughing when she cooked it. But Mummy didn't know. Mrs. Olabisi nodded slowly. And how did that make you feel? Daisy shrugged. Like I did a superhero thing. But also like I did something wrong. Auntie Clara said not to tell anyone. The therapist leaned forward. It wasn't wrong, sweetheart. You protected your mummy. That was very brave. Meanwhile, outside the therapy room, Theodore stood beside a uniformed officer as they reviewed Daisy's session, carefully recorded with parental consent. The audio was clear, her words simple but precise. This testimony changes everything, the officer said. A child that age can't fabricate intent like this, not with that kind of detail. Vivian, standing a few feet away, kept her arms folded tightly around herself. She's still having nightmares, she said, her voice strained. She wakes up thinking Clara is hiding behind the curtains. The officer turned. This gives us legal grounds to pursue psychological endangerment, and with the physical evidence, Clara will likely face multiple counts, including attempted murder. Vivian nodded. I'm not doing this for revenge, she said quietly. I'm doing it so no one ever has to go through what my daughter did. As Daisy exited the room holding a new sticker chart, she ran to Vivian. Did I do good, Mummy? Vivian knelt and hugged her tight. You did better than good, my love. You spoke the truth. That's what heroes do. And with that, they stepped out of the clinic hand in hand, one step closer to justice, one heartbeat closer to peace. The conference room at the Family Services Division was filled with quiet tension as Vivian sat across from the investigative team. Theodore was beside her, his posture calm but alert, and a social worker sat nearby with a pen poised over her notepad. On the center of the table was a recording device and a printed transcript of Daisy's therapy session. An officer from the Criminal Investigation Department cleared his throat and began. We've reviewed the child's testimony multiple times. The consistency of her statements, especially the nonverbal cues she displayed when recalling the incident, solidifies intent on the part of Ms. Clara Nwosu. Vivian nodded silently, gripping the hem of her blouse under the table. The officer continued. We've also matched her fingerprints to a container recovered from the kitchen waste bin. And toxicology confirms that the chemical residue on the dinnerware matches the substance found in her system. The room was quiet for a moment, then the officer leaned forward. Mrs. Okoye, I have to ask, do you want to press additional charges? Vivian exhaled deeply, the weight of the question more emotional than legal. I want to protect my daughter, she said. Not just from Clara, but from growing up thinking silence is the answer to pain. Theodore placed a hand on her back gently. We'll pursue every lawful option, he assured her. The officer nodded and stood. We'll be filing for a motion to revoke Ms. Nwosu's conditional discharge and proceed to full trial. Her attempt to distort the narrative in public is only worsening her case. As the team packed up, Vivian whispered to herself, This isn't justice for me. It's for Daisy. That night, as she read Daisy a bedtime story, Vivian's voice didn't shake. Her heart was still tired, but her spirit was no longer silent. The storm that once terrified her now taught her how to swim, and she would never drown in anyone's betrayal again. Clara sat upright in her hospital bed, the corners of her mouth tight with pain as she applied lip balm to her cracked lips. The swelling on her face had reduced slightly, but the disfigurement was undeniable. She wore a silk scarf to hide the gauze beneath her chin. A small television in the corner played muted news coverage, though her eyes stayed fixed on the window. She hadn't left the hospital in weeks. The knock on the door startled her. A nurse entered first, followed by two officers in plain clothes. One stepped forward and announced, Ms. Clara Nwosu, you are under arrest for attempted murder, endangerment of a minor, and unlawful possession of a controlled substance. Clara's hands shook as the clipboard was handed to her for acknowledgement. You can't be serious, she gasped. I'm the one who got hurt. The younger officer replied calmly, and the evidence shows it was self-inflicted, and for someone else. Clara looked around frantically, as if hoping this was a mistake or some cruel joke. But no one was laughing. As they read her rights, Clara began to cry, not the dramatic sob she had once used to manipulate Samuel or the helpless whimper of a woman seeking pity. This was raw, panicked crying, the sound of someone realizing their entire house of cards had collapsed. "Please, I was desperate," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "She took everything from me." The older officer looked at her with no sympathy. "You walked into her home. You tried to erase her. You nearly killed a mother in front of her own child." Clara's sobs intensified as they placed the cuffs gently around her wrists. She turned to the nurse as they led her out. "Tell Samuel I need to speak to him." "Please, he'll explain. He knows I loved him." But the nurse only watched silently, her lips pressed into a line. Outside, a car waited to take Clara to the holding facility for further questioning. The world she thought she controlled had finally stopped spinning for her, and now, for the first time, she had no script, no camera, and no savior. Samuel stood in the center of his once lively living room, the air heavy with silence. The framed photo of Daisy's 6th birthday, one of the few Vivian hadn't taken with her, sat on the shelf, dusty and slightly crooked. He hadn't touched it since they left. Now, with Clara officially under arrest and the truth unmistakable, the gravity of his choices came crashing down. He hadn't just lost a marriage, he had abandoned trust. Betrayed a woman who had done nothing but stand by him. Betrayed a child who looked at him now with quiet distance. When he finally knocked on Theodore's door, it wasn't as a man seeking defense. It was as a man coming to confess. Vivian opened the door, surprised. Samuel stood there, no pride in his posture, just brokenness. "Can I see Daisy?" he asked quietly. "She's asleep," Vivian said. "And honestly, I don't know if she wants to see you right now." His shoulders slumped. "I understand." He stared at the floor, then looked up, tears clouding his vision. "I failed you. I failed her. I let evil into our lives and I dressed it in love." Vivian didn't speak for a moment. "You didn't just let it in," she said. "You gave it a bed and invited it to dinner." The words stung, but he nodded. "I deserve that. All of it. I wanted to fix something that wasn't broken. And I broke everything instead." Vivian stepped outside, shutting the door gently behind her so Daisy wouldn't hear. "You want to make things right?" she asked. He nodded. "Then start by staying away until she's ready. Start by fixing the man you see in the mirror. Because the one I married doesn't live there anymore." Samuel broke down then, right there on the porch, silent tears tracing years of arrogance, blindness, and pride. Vivian watched him with sadness, but no hate. She didn't want revenge. She wanted peace. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of Samuel's own path to repentance. The path he'd now have to walk alone. The courtroom was cold, both in temperature and spirit. Vivian sat quietly near the front, dressed in a simple navy gown. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her expression unreadable. On the opposite side, Clara was wheeled in by officers, her face partially hidden behind medical gauze and a veil of shame. The audience buzzed with tension, reporters lined the back, and Samuel sat in the last row, far from both women. The judge called the court to order, and what followed was a sequence of testimony, evidence, and a slow unraveling of Clara's defense. Vivian didn't flinch when the prosecutor described the chemical components found in Clara's kitchen. She remained steady when Daisy's recorded statement was played in the courtroom, her small voice echoing in that vast chamber. Clara refused to meet anyone's gaze. Her lawyer asked for leniency, citing mental distress, emotional instability, and abandonment, but the judge was unmoved. The intent was premeditated, and the child's presence only worsened the gravity. When Clara was finally asked if she had anything to say, her voice trembled as she stood, barely supported by the rail in front of her. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she began, tears already pooling. "I was hurt. I was left behind. I thought if Vivian disappeared, everything would go back to how it should have been." Gasps echoed in the courtroom, but Clara pressed on. "Yes, I poured it into her food. Yes, I watched her plate. And yes, I smiled when I thought she'd eat it. But I never thought the little girl." Her voice broke. "I never thought Daisy would switch it." She turned toward the bench. "She saved her mother from the devil. That devil was me." Her confession hung in the air like thick smoke. The judge's gavel tapped once. "Thank you for your honesty," he said with cold finality. "Sentencing will proceed tomorrow." As Clara was wheeled out of the courtroom, There were no cheers. Just silence. A silence that followed her like a shadow. And for Vivian, that silence was louder than any scream she could have mustered. The next day, the courtroom was packed again, this time for sentencing. Before the verdict was read, the judge granted Vivian the right to address the court. She rose slowly, each step deliberate, and walked to the front with a poise that commanded stillness. Facing the judge, jury, and everyone seated, she took a breath and began. "I stand here not as a victim," she said clearly, "but as a mother who nearly lost everything because of envy wearing the face of friendship." She turned briefly toward Clara, but didn't linger. She called me sister. She held my hand. She entered my home and sat at my table. I forgave her more times than I can count. But forgiveness isn't blindness. She paused, letting the words settle. What she did was beyond betrayal. It was an attempt to erase me so she could wear my life like a dress she thought she deserved. Her voice trembled but never broke. "I'm not here to demand a punishment. That's not my place. I'm here to make a promise to my daughter, to other women who've ever been gaslit into silence." She looked at the judge now, her tone firm. "We must teach girls that their voices matter. That evil doesn't need horns. It wears lipstick, smiles wide, and sometimes sleeps in your guest room." Several people gasped softly. "I don't hate her," Vivian added. "That's the gift I refuse to give. But I won't protect her either. Let the law do what the heart sometimes cannot." She stepped away from the podium. As she returned to her seat, Samuel's eyes followed her with a weighty reverence, a mixture of admiration and guilt. The judge's gavel struck the desk once more. "Ms. Clara Nwosu, this court sentences you to 12 years imprisonment with no eligibility for early release. This sentence reflects not just your actions, but the lasting impact on a child's mind and a mother's life." Clara wept silently as she was escorted out. Vivian closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled, not with triumph, but with quiet release. The chapter wasn't closed, but the ink had dried. And this time, she had written the ending. In the days following the sentencing, Samuel requested a formal meeting with Vivian, this time not at a doorstep or behind tears, but in Theodore's office, where lines were clear and intentions documented. Vivian entered the room with Daisy beside her, while Samuel stood alone on the opposite end. "I asked for this meeting," he began, "because I've made a decision I should have made a long time ago." He turned to Theodore, who was quietly reviewing the legal papers. "I'm signing over full custody of Daisy to Vivian. I'll make arrangements for financial support, school fees, everything. But I won't disrupt her routine anymore." Vivian studied him carefully, unsure of what to say. "Why now?" she finally asked. Samuel looked at Daisy, who peeked from behind her mother's arm. "Because she no longer calls me daddy in her sleep," he said, voice raw. "Because when she draws family pictures now, I'm not in them. And I don't blame her. I just want her to feel safe." Theodore handed the documents to Vivian, who read through the pages slowly. There it was, in black and white, full legal custody, with Samuel relinquishing all decision-making rights. She took a pen, signed, and then passed the paper to Samuel, who followed suit. The room was quiet except for the scratching of ink. When it was done, Vivian looked at him one last time. "You may have let us down, but this shows you're trying to fix the damage." He nodded. "It's the least I can do." Vivian knelt and whispered to Daisy, "Say goodbye." Daisy looked up at her father and gave a small wave. "Bye, Mr. Samuel." Samuel closed his eyes briefly at the sting of the words but didn't correct her. He just smiled faintly and said, "Goodbye, Daisy. Be kind like your mother." As they walked out, Samuel remained seated, staring at the empty seat across from him. The house was gone. The title of father redefined. But what he had given up that day was more than a child. It was the illusion that he could ever go back to the way things were. The garden behind Theodore's house had once been overgrown and neglected, but now it blossomed with quiet color. Vivian knelt near the far corner, her hands buried in the earth as she pressed new rose stems into the soil. Daisy, a tiny watering can in hand, moved between beds with the gentleness of a child who'd seen too much but was learning joy again. The months following Clara's sentencing had been filled with quiet restoration, no grand declarations, just small routines that steadied their world again. Therapy continued, but Daisy no longer woke up from nightmares screaming Clara's name. Vivian no longer checked doors twice before sleeping. Peace wasn't immediate, but it was real, growing day by day like the tulips in her care. When Theodore stepped out onto the porch that morning with 2 mugs of tea, he watched them for a while before joining them. "You've turned this place into something beautiful," he said softly, handing her a mug. Vivian smiled, brushing her forehead with her soil-streaked glove. "I think it's the first thing I've nurtured in a long time without fear of it being taken." Theodore nodded and crouched beside her. "And you've done it all with grace." Daisy ran over with muddy feet and laughter in her eyes. "Mummy, look. My flower is standing tall like me." Vivian pulled her close and kissed her cheek. "Yes, darling, just like you." Theodore watched them quietly, then said, "You know, peace doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it means living fully with the memory and choosing differently." Vivian turned to him. "I'm not looking for new beginnings. I'm just thankful this one didn't end in ashes." Theodore placed his hand gently over hers, not with pressure, but with presence. "Whatever you're building, whether it's flowers or a new future, you don't have to do it alone." Vivian didn't answer right away. She just looked at Daisy, her daughter's joy undisturbed, and whispered, "One season at a time." And so they sat together, 3 souls who had been scarred by lies, now learning how to bloom in truth. 6 months later, the world had moved on, but for Vivian, time felt more intentional. The scandal had faded from the newspapers, Clara's name only mentioned in passing among the few still curious. Life was quieter now, filled with school runs, cooking lessons with Daisy, and community projects that helped women rebuild their dignity after betrayal. On a sunny Saturday morning, Vivian and Daisy stepped out of a bookstore cafe, holding a new journal and a children's storybook. As they strolled down the path leading home, Daisy paused at a newsstand. On the front page of a folded tabloid was a grainy photo of Clara in an orange prison uniform, seated in the corner of a courtroom. Above the image, once a mistress, now a cautionary tale. Daisy looked up at her mother. "Will she come back one day?" she asked, voice quiet but sure. Vivian bent down, brushing her daughter's hair behind her ears. "Not into our lives," she said gently. "Some people write themselves out of our story, and we don't need to turn that page again." They continued walking, the wind brushing against their skin, the scent of roasted groundnuts from a nearby stall wafting in the air. As they reached their gate, Vivian stopped to admire the front yard. New flowers bloomed where old thorns had once been. The home no longer reminded her of pain, it had become her sanctuary. Inside, Theodore waited with brunch on the table, laughter waiting to fill the room. "How was the bookstore?" he asked, taking Daisy's new book. "We found treasure," Daisy beamed. Vivian laughed, sitting down as sunlight poured through the window. "And left a ghost behind," she added, almost to herself. As they ate together, the clinking of cutlery and the melody of contentment filled the house. No vengeance, no bitterness, just quiet victory. Vivian looked around, heart full, not because she'd defeated anyone, but because she'd survived everything. And as she watched Daisy scribble joyfully on a fresh page of her journal, Vivian whispered a truth to herself. The story didn't end when she walked away, it began. And this time it was hers alone. Here's the Bible verse, Proverbs 26, verse 27. "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them." Explanation. This verse mirrors Clara's downfall. Her attempt to harm Vivian through deception and poison ended up bringing judgment upon herself. What she meant for evil returned to her, just as Scripture warns. The verse also highlights the spiritual truth that evil plots eventually unravel at the feet of their creators. Moral of the story: envy turns trusted hands into hidden daggers, but truth, no matter how quietly it walks, always finds its voice. This story teaches us that betrayal often begins under the guise of friendship, and those who act from jealousy may destroy themselves trying to destroy others. Vivian's quiet strength, Daisy's innocent loyalty, and the power of truth show that vengeance isn't necessary when justice is allowed to take its course. In the end, grace is not silence, and silence is not weakness.